Hello everyone, this is Peter from Birds of Play and welcome to 5 Things to Fix. A series where we propose 5 fixes for Final Fantasy games, even though they probably don't need them. In this video, we will be taking a look at an often overlooked classic that has nevertheless managed to gather quite a cult following. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi has even gone on record to note this as his favorite game in the series. I am of course referring to the fantastically light-hearted, yet deeply life-affirming Final Fantasy IX. Let's get fixin'. Fix number 1. Stealing. Final Fantasy IX is very much an homage to the roots of the Final Fantasy series, sidestepping many innovations introduced in its 2 PlayStation predecessors, Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, instead opting for a back-to-basics approach and return to high fantasy. With this came the reinvigoration of the class system, each character having certain abilities and stats, as opposed to everything being mostly interchangeable, depending on how skills and magic are equipped. This means that the characters in Final Fantasy IX all have a specific role to play, Freya being a dragoon, reminiscent of Kain Highwind from Final Fantasy IV, Quina being a blue mage, akin to Strago from Final Fantasy VI, and Vivi being a black mage with glowing eyes like the one found in the original Final Fantasy, that definitely don't look anything like Javas from Star Wars. Seeing as Zidane, the main protagonist of Final Fantasy IX, is a thief, it stands to reason that the steal ability would play a pivotal role in the game. Stealing from bosses is especially important since they, more often than not, seem to carry around some impressive equipment that comes at just the right time to give the party that extra edge, featuring stats and abilities that typically won't be available until a bit later in the game. In addition to this, each successful steal powers up Zidane's thievery ability, enabling him to do more damage based on the number of items stolen by him or other thief characters. This potentially makes it one of the most powerful attacks in the game that even disregards the target's defense and protect status. The viability of this ability is nevertheless dependent on the player taking Zidane's profession as a thief seriously. That is, however, easier said than done, at least when it comes to bosses, since it can often take quite a few attempts for a steal to be successful. This can become particularly grueling when you are faced with a difficult boss fight, your party gradually getting whittled down as Zidane zooms back and forth without anything to show for it. The easy fix would be to simply increase the rate of successful steals and be done with it. Although that might be just a little bit too easy, since even though it can be frustrating when failure overstays its welcome, it can be equally thrilling to have to balance the momentary risk of dying with the prospect of getting some good gear for the future. So, short of tweaking percentage numbers to find that elusive sweet spot, I would like to propose an alternative solution, perhaps something as simple as Tidus' overdrive mechanic from Final Fantasy X. Having the player press a button at the right time to trigger a successful steal, rare items requiring faster reaction time. The benefit of this approach would be to relegate the burden of success to the players themselves and their skill, cutting out luck as a middleman, and making players responsible for their own grubby hands. Just remember kids, only steal if you're handsome. Fix number 2. Tetramaster. Much like Final Fantasy VIII did with Triple Triad, Final Fantasy IX featured its own unique card-based minigame in the form of Tetramaster, or Quad Mist as it was known in the Japanese version. The rules were similar to Triple Triad, with rectangular cards being placed on a grid and the cards getting flipped as a result of battling with other cards. The player with the most cards facing up being the winner of the match. Tetramaster, however, made several changes to the formula, enlarging the playing field, introducing randomly generated grid blocks, as well as the ability for some cards to attack diagonally and even level up. The biggest change, nevertheless, being the way the outcomes of the battles were calculated, with cards having a certain power level, a specific battle class, and 2 different values for physical and magical defense, the final outcome being decided by percentages, meaning that Tetramaster is ultimately luck-based. That doesn't mean you can't tip the scales in your favor. It just means that even if you know exactly what you're doing and have the best card for the job, there is still a chance you might lose the battle. Another thing that separates Tetramaster from Triple Triad is that it's self-contained, meaning that it doesn't influence the rest of the game. Well, unless you count the part where you're forced to take part in a Tetramaster tournament in order to progress through the story. In Final Fantasy VIII, you could trade cards for items that could then be either used or transformed into valuable magic. In Final Fantasy IX, however, the game is its own reward, not giving you access to any special abilities or equipment. The best you can hope for is more and better cards to improve your game of Tetramaster. So if you're planning to play Tetramaster religiously, don't hold your breath for some ultimate reward at the end of the tunnel. Contrary to what you might think, I'm not going to advocate for the rules of Tetramaster to be changed, even though I'm not a big fan of the luck-based aspect of the game. I'm also not going to claim that Final Fantasy IX should implement some sort of reward system, letting you trade cards for items like in Final Fantasy VIII. Instead, I would like to talk about this, the interface for the card storage. If you're going to have a completely self-contained card game, then I feel like the collection aspect should be more engaging. What we need to think about is not only the gameplay value of these cards, but also how they help establish the image of what is being portrayed on the cards. The monster designs in Final Fantasy IX are arguably better, or more aesthetically coherent than those from Final Fantasy VIII. But Final Fantasy VIII's card game did a better job of establishing their brand by dividing the monsters into tiers, and by letting you exchange cards for valuable items. The monster cards that netted the most valuable items becoming especially memorable. There's no one right way to fix this. But one way the cards could have become more engaging, aside from adopting the same strategy used in Final Fantasy VIII, is by giving us a more visually satisfying way to store the cards, as well as making some of the cards more visually appealing.
Mom, look! I got a Tom Brady foil card. I'm gonna put it in my totally sick Moogle folder. Kapopo!
Fix number 3. Character development. Final Fantasy IX has a very vibrant cast of characters, each being unique in both form and function. The diversity of the cast really speaking to the game's overall message about harmonious coexistence and life in all its myriad of forms being something to cherish, no matter how fleeting it may be. All the cast members have their own distinct motivations for participating in the adventure, and it's a real joy to gradually have them introduced as you progress through the game. Aside from the starting party, the other party members can, however, feel a bit overlooked once they have served their original purpose. For example, Freya is featured quite prominently as the party runs to the aid of Prometheus when Alexandria invades. Once this part of the adventure is over, Freya nevertheless seems to take more of a back seat, since her own story presumably didn't warrant as much attention now that it doesn't align as neatly with the main plot. This is a real shame, since the game had already spent time establishing her character. The theme of memory and its relation to the concept of life and death was also a valid addition to the thematic canvas of the game, not only dealing with literal death, but also how being forgotten can function as a form of death, hinting at the importance of bonds that we form with others and how necessary it is to maintain them. Even though I would have loved to see Freya's story explored more thoroughly, there is another character that I would like to prioritize. It's not Quina, since Quina is and always will be the best at doing whatever Quina does. No, the character that I feel would benefit most from some extra attention is Amarant. And no, it's not just because he's red. Amarant is the last addition to the party, and as such, well, he's a bit late to the party, thereby getting less screen time by default. As a testimony to how Amarant plays second fiddle to the rest of the party, he's the only character the player never takes control of out in the field. Regarding his backstory, we do get a glimpse into how his past intersected with that of Zidane, but it feels rather rushed and his motivation ends up falling rather flat. One way to fix this would have been to allow players that were interested to uncover more details about Amarant. For example, in a similar fashion, the player gets to learn about Vincent Valentine in the Shinra Mansion from Final Fantasy VII as optional content. Whatever that content would reveal about Amarant, just don't tell me he's a vampire. Fix number 4. Trance mode. Ever since Final Fantasy VI introduced the concept of desperation attacks to the Final Fantasy series, we have seen similar mechanics pop up in most subsequent installments. The most famous iteration of these mechanics being the limit breaks from Final Fantasy VII. In Final Fantasy IX, these mechanics were introduced as trance, a temporary mode that enhances physical damage and gives characters access to some unique abilities. Much like some Final Fantasy games have incorporated summons as a game mechanic into the actual plot of the game, trans mode made limit breaks into an actual plot point, and something that is meant to be an actual part of the game world. The first time we see it in action, Steiner notes that trance is a legendary state of being, induced by a surge of powerful emotions, and that he has only heard about it, but never actually seen it. It can be very interesting to see game mechanics such as limit breaks given a proper context in terms of game lore. The way this is done in Final Fantasy IX, however, isn't very consistent. For example, Steiner, who is so in awe of trance the first time he sees it, can just as easily enter trance mode himself after taking enough damage. This also matches poorly with Steiner's claim that trance is induced by a surge of powerful emotions. Seeing as, depending on the situation, a relatively minor attack might be the Ooglop that breaks the Gargant's back. There are examples of trance mode being activated at times that make sense in the story. For example, when Vivi encounters Black Waltz number 3 and is overcome with powerful emotions. Most of the time, however, trance mode will be wasted on some nobodies out in the field, which is a shame because it takes a lot longer for the trance gauge to build in comparison to limit breaks. And to make matters worse, you can't save trance mode for when you really need it. One way to fix trance mode would simply be to speed up how long it takes for the trance gauge to fill, so it wouldn't feel as such a waste. Another fix would be to simply let players save their trance for when they really need it. Trance could even become a sort of desperation attack, only available when the character is in danger or has taken significant damage. But the fix I would like to propose has to do with the very foundation of trance as a concept in the world of Final Fantasy IX, as established by Steiner's exposition. And that is to not let everybody have access to trance mode right off the bat. Make it exclusive to Zidane, for reasons that will become clearer later in the game. And then, let the other characters gradually awaken to this power. Make Vivi enter trance mode for the first time when he encounters the Black Waltz on the airship, making the moment even more powerful. Make Freya enter trance mode for the first time when she faces Beatrix in the ruins of Burmecia. Make Quina enter trance mode for the first time when Quina enters the town of Clara and gets disappointed in the local cuisine. Well, maybe not, but you get my point. Characters should awaken to trance at pivotal moments in their own personal stories, making the moment even more impactful and making trance make even more sense as an element of the story. Either that, or change trance into dance. Fix number 5. Mognet. Mognet is a postal service run by Moguls and for Moguls, although other races have been known to use the service. The player is invited to help deliver mail, since the postal service seems to be having some problems delivering mail. This in itself is a welcome addition, as it pairs quite nicely with the active time event system, both of them giving us a glimpse into the wider world of Final Fantasy IX, making the game world better rounded and less centered on Zidane, which is refreshing since the last 2 installments were so heavily focused on the main character. The point where Mognet starts to become a problem for me is when making deliveries and picking up new orders becomes something that's easy to miss. This ties into a larger problem with Final Fantasy IX and missables, sometimes making you feel like you have to have a walkthrough just to make sure you don't miss anything along the way. However, I will let the missables slide for now. What I will say though is that the game shouldn't actively go out of its way to make things harder than they have to be. This brings me to one of my biggest pet peeves with Final Fantasy IX. Here it comes. Why do you have to talk to Moguls more than one time in order to get mail from them? For this one, the fix is quite simple. If you want me to deliver your mail, just tell me. Don't make me jump through hoops. Thank you for checking out 5 things to fix in Final Fantasy IX. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Also, don't forget to tell us some of your fixes down in the comments below. Until next time. Are my bird sounds getting better?